Hello, everyone, and welcome to Insert Character. I'm Dylan. I'm bad at hosting. We have a better host here today, but he's not gonna host because he doesn't need to. This is Gary.
Hello.
He works for the same person that I work for.
Yes.
Explain yourself, Gary.
So I am Gary. I am the camera operator, set designer, and eBay store manager for Comicstorian. And I also have my own YouTube channel called Film Circuit that focuses on all things film. But when I do dive into pop culture, it's usually sci-fi and fantasy. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
And you also have a couple podcasts, one of which I edit. We have Beam Me Up, Gary, which is a sci-fi podcast, and The Conspirament, which is a conspiracy podcast, which I thoroughly enjoy.
Yes. The Conspirament was actually... I had expressed to Benny, I was like, yeah, I'd love to talk about, conspiracy theories and things like that. And then he just sort of made it my show, which I didn't really expect. He actually started as the host, essentially, and then just kind of gave it over to me. And one day, I think we were actually in the middle of the show, and he said, well, you're the host. I was like,
oh, okay.
Okay. Oh, okay. I guess I'm the host. Conspirament and Beam Me Up Gary. Beam Me Up Gary is probably the only consistent thing on my channel right now. And Conspirament is every other week over on the Benny Potter YouTube page or YouTube channel. And so those are...
This show is sort of in a similar boat as The Conspirament, where it'll go up on the Patreon a week early and then just release on my channel afterwards. So if you didn't know that, if you have just been watching these regularly and seen people in the comments from like a week ago, that's why. So if you want to go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/comicstorian, you can do that. It's a fun time. You could see Gary more. You could see other people that have been on this podcast more, except Joel. I don't think he's on any of those, but, it's fine. You can catch him on his own channel. I don't know why I'm promoting Joel. You're here today, Gary.
I don't know. That's all right. We can promote Joel. It's okay.
Joel's a nice guy. He deserves promotion.
Yeah.
All right. So, who is the character that you have brought with you today, Gary?
Well, I wish I actually brought him with me today. Oh. Unfortunately, I could not.
He's not there?
I couldn't afford Avery Brooks, who's the person who plays Captain Sisko on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. That's the character I chose to talk about today. Nice.
So we talked about this a little bit off camera and leading up to this. And I mentioned this in the last episode, and it's evidenced as sort of by the second episode where we talked about Power Rangers. This is not, despite it going on the Comicstorian Patreon and on a YouTube channel called Auram's Comics, this isn't a comic book exclusive podcast. So it's just called Insert Character. So my goal of it is just to bring people on and talk about characters that they like. And Gary, and I do want to sort of ask you about your whole comic book knowledge, not to try and like gatekeep you or anything, but I'm just honestly curious because I know you're not like a current reader or anything, but you have read some books, I imagine.
I've read one.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I've always been a big fan of the comic book stories. I've been a big fan since I was a kid of Spider-Man, Iron Man, Batman, all the other mans. And but I've never actually read a comic book until recently. Benny Potter, Comicstorian, of course, basically gave me homework, and so I took home these comics, and I've actually read one issue of the New 52 Flash, and I have not read anything else yet. Benny actually also bought me. I just hit my own mic. Benny also bought me a Green Lantern Star Trek crossover comic book series, which I'm actually excited to get into, just haven't really had much of an opportunity yet. So mostly my exposure to comic books and comic book culture is movies, cartoons, and that's about it. Gotcha. But if you were to say... mentioning most things about comics, I have a vague idea, especially since I started working with Comicstorian. I've kind of absorbed the knowledge and the kind of the random facts about DC and Marvel, and so that's my exposure to comic books.
Yeah, that's definitely when you're around people who like live and breathe comics, you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna pick up some stuff whether you like it or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially since
Definitely.
you're sort of you're a pretty regular co-host on R&B and stuff like that. You're
Mm-hmm.
all over the place on that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So you have and that's always healthy for slightly tangential here, but that's always healthy for people who are so entrenched in comics to have like an outsider's opinion, which I feel like is what I am going to be bringing to this Star Trek conversation we're about to have, considering
Yeah.
I have seen maybe half of an episode of the original series and the first two of the like rebooted movies that J.J. Abrams started.
Okay. Right.
That's the extent of my Star Trek knowledge.
I'm sorry that you've had only that exposure to Star Trek. Yeah, I've been watching it since I was like 3 or 4 years old, with Star Trek: The Next Generation and then everything after that. So
Captain Sisko, I did a little bit of reading on him. He's from Deep Space Nine, which is that the second Star Trek series, or where does that fit in the continuity?
So in the total continuity, as far as the TV series goes, Deep Space Nine is actually the third Star Trek series, if you don't count the animated series based on the original series. Deep Space Nine was the third installment of the Star Trek series. It aired in 1993, and it was actually the first Star Trek series to take place on a space station instead of a traveling starship.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've heard most of the like outsider looking in of conversations that I've heard about Star Trek, Deep Space Nine seems to be the one that comes up the most of like people's favorite, or
Really?
just the one that people really enjoy, I guess. I don't know. I've just heard a lot about Deep Space Nine.
Well, and that's actually for good reason. Deep Space Nine kind of broke the basic mold of Star Trek. It was the first Star Trek to introduce a black captain. It was the first Star Trek, again, to take place on a space station. It was the first Star Trek to have this long ongoing story arc, which takes place a little later in the series. And it was just the first Star Trek to do a lot of things first, as far as that series of TV series goes.
Interesting. So what about Captain Sisko, getting more into him? What about him draws you to the character? What's he all about?
Well, I have to preface this with the fact that Sisko is probably not my favorite captain, but I think he's the most interesting captain. My favorite has to be Jean-Luc Picard from The Next Generation, mostly because if there's anyone that I want leading me, assuming I'm a part of the crew, leading me and my crewmates on a mission of discovery, I would want it to be Picard. But what most intrigues me about Sisko is not the fact that he was the first black captain. I honestly, when you're watching the series, that isn't even on your mind most of the time. There's one episode much later in the series where they actually he like hallucinates being back in like the 1940s, and that's the theme of the story, is dealing with a black captain. But he intrigues me the most because he's the first captain that has a backstory from the first episode. From the first few moments of the series, you get this really rich, strong backstory. So his backstory is rooted in loss. When you're first introduced to the character, he's actually on a ship that's being attacked by the Borg, and this little kind of mini story actually takes place when Picard was actually turned into the Borg Locutus. And so you have this kind of tension between Sisko and between Sisko and Picard, because he essentially holds Picard responsible for the death of his wife, who was on the ship with him. And so there's this immediate tension and backstory to this character that you really don't get with other captains and leaders in Star Trek. You're introduced to the character, but you're not introduced to really much about them. And he was the first one to actually bring you into the character's past before you get into the character's present, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Every other captain was just sort of introduced. It was like, here's the captain, let's go.
Just drop in.
and he was the first one to actually have a backstory from the moment the show started.
That's interesting. And that's like, I don't know, I don't know why I never considered this, but I imagine there is a lot of in this, because the Star Trek like different series that have seasons of their own, they all share a continuity, right? They cross over and stuff.
Yes, they do, actually. So you had the original series back in the 60s, and then you had the movies, which lined up pretty much... Okay, so basically when the movies were wrapping up, about this time you had The Next Generation coming onto the air. When The Next Generation was announced, there was actually a lot of fan backlash because people were saying, like, this is not my captain. We want the original cast back, very much like we do today.
Sure.
Whenever something, a big franchise has changed, it would be like introducing a new Avengers that didn't exist in the comics.
Right.
It would be like introducing these new characters and powers and everything that we had no concept of before. So Star Trek The Next Generation really was the beginning of modern Star Trek, what we think of, or this image we have in our mind of modern Star Trek. So you have The Next Generation, which aired, I believe, in 1987, and then you have DS9, which aired in 1993. Now, the first episode, and this is kind of a theme that goes on until Enterprise airs in 2001, I believe, where the first episode of the new series crosses over with an episode of the current running series. Oh. So the first episode of DS9 also crossed over with The Next Generation, because you actually had a character leave The Next Generation and join DS9 in that first episode. And they do the same thing when Star Trek Voyager aired in 1995. You had the first episode of Voyager overlapped with an episode of DS9. And so you had this long running, it was really a cinematic universe for TV before the cinematic universe was common.
Yeah,
it was probably, I believe, one of the first series to really have this decades spanning storyline going.
So is that, do they play with that a lot, or is it usually just like the first episode to sort of comfort you into the idea of a new cast? Is it usually just that, right, like they cross over this once to get you situated and then no other characters come back up, or is there always like other past or future characters coming in?
I would say it's mostly true that when, that first episode really, and that's actually a good point, that it is kind of a comfort zone for the viewer to say, okay, well, this is connected, and I recognize some of these characters, and they kind of ease you into the new series. Back in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, television was still very episodic. You didn't have these long-running storylines. Some series, like DS9, had long-running storylines, but overall, not really. There wasn't much crossover between the different series. You had some events that impacted other events in different other series, like the tension between certain alien races in DS9 would be expressed or talked about in Voyager, or you'd have a character here and there pop in and out between Voyager and DS9 and Next Generation. But overall, not really. There wasn't much that affected. In fact, Voyager, because it took place in the Delta Quadrant, which is on the other side of the galaxy, nothing that happened to DS9 affected Voyager at all. Because exactly, and so that was kind of how they overcame that little gap there. Not a whole lot actually influenced the series. Like, there wasn't a lot of inter-influence, if we can make up a word here, between the series. Yeah,
that makes sense. That's how I've sort of always seen Star Trek for some reason. Like I said earlier, like I never even thought that like a lot of crossover or shared continuity was going on. And I think that's because I've always heard of Star Trek in their like different series. Like I imagined in like in the Next Generation, the however many seasons of that, of course they would share continuity, characters and stuff, but I always saw like Deep Space Nine or Voyager of just like different types of Star Trek or something. And I think that especially came from like the first real, I guess, amount of Star Trek knowledge that I had was a straight up reboot. in the J.J.
okay.
Abrams movies. So I was like,
J.J.
oh,
Abrams
okay,
movies,
this is what Star Trek does. This is what the series were. But it's interesting that I was completely wrong on that.
Yeah, and the thing about the J.J. Abrams movies is that they are their own thing. They're their own timeline. It's called the Kelvin timeline. So you have the Prime timeline and then the Kelvin timeline. And the movies have gone off and done completely their own thing. And I think Star Trek as a whole is better off for that because the new series of movies are so different from the Star Trek that we got on television that I think that was actually a very, very wise choice, for them.
Yeah.
And that gets us into like Star Trek Discovery and how everybody says it's the Prime universe, but it has all the makings of the Kelvin timeline, and that's a whole big nerdy debate right there. But so.
Yeah, I heard when that's the show that's airing right now, right?
Yep, it's on CBS All Access, so you actually have to pay to watch it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
but I've heard like when that show was coming out, there was outrage about because the captain she's a woman and she's black, right? People were mad about that or something.
She's actually the first officer.
Okay.
That was also something that Discovery did that no other Star Trek did, which I don't really have a problem with.
Yeah.
So you have the main character who's actually the first officer. She's a black woman, and that wasn't, as far as like fan outrage, that didn't really annoy anybody.
Okay.
She's just an annoing character.
Okay. I remember hearing people complaining about her, and then I probably saw some like clickbaity articles like these racist fans are angry about blah blah blah, and just trying to get clicks.
Exactly. That's pretty much what it is. As far as I know, nobody couldn't care less about her rank, her gender, her race, or anything like that. Yeah, she's just a bad character. Like,
fair enough.
She is ready to fight. Like, she always looks like she's ready to punch someone in the face, and that's just not somebody you want to invest in, like in a TV series.
Oh, sure.
So, so the whole show just has a lot going against it when it comes to like true diehard Star Trek fans. I'm sure there are lots of fans who are new to the series who absolutely love it because it's their it's their first Star Trek. They think that this is just what Star Trek is, and it just has a lot of problems as far as traditional Star Trek goes.
Yeah. Especially with in like going back to what you were saying about that character always being ready to like fight something, which from someone who doesn't know much about Star Trek, I've always sort of considered Star Trek to be like, whereas, and not to invoke like the Star Wars versus Star Trek debate, but
sure,
where Star Wars is very action packed and fighty and lightsabers swinging around, Star Trek has always to me been very diplomatic, and you resolve things with words, and that's like a common criticism I heard when I was younger of being like, I don't like Star Trek because it's slow, and I'm like, okay, well maybe you're a child and you don't care about slow yet.
Right.
And that's probably why I didn't get into it, because my dad was really into Star Trek, and he's the reason I saw like half of an episode when I was really young, and I think I just fell asleep because I was like 8.
My wife actually falls asleep to Star Trek every time I put it on.
Yeah.
If she can't sleep, I'll just put on an episode of like Star Trek Voyager, and just through the opening sequence of the series, she'll fall right to sleep. But that's more of a like melodic kind of everything's kind of slow. She's a very smart woman. But Star Trek has always been very cerebral. It's a sci-fi series that asks a lot of questions, and especially nowadays, that's not very palatable to people because they're accustomed to sci-fi being big and sweeping and epic, and there's space battles and it's just chaos, and or they're accustomed to the very common trend nowadays, which is like space horror, where there's a monster on the ship, or who can blow up who first, and true tried and true Star Trek as far as the series go, they weren't really like that. There were moments, sure, you had ship to ship battles and one-on-one battles with the classic double fist punch to the back, and sure, you had those things, and they were interesting, but the bulk, you're absolutely right, the bulk of the series was very intellectually, it always looked for, and this is because of Roddenberry's vision of the future and how Roddenberry believed, conflict should be handled. It was, how diplomatic can we be? Can we find a peaceful resolution? Whereas nowadays, and even through the 90s and 80s, there's always been an audience for mindless violence.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people have always kind of struggled with that nature of Star Trek. I was watching a while ago, it was I think Cracked did a fake, no, it was The Onion, did a fake review of the Star Trek J.J. Abrams movie. And they said that, have you seen that review?
I haven't seen that one, but last one I watched was the one for Civil War, I think. It's so funny.
Okay. Yeah, and they basically said that tried and true Star Trek fans are deriding the movie as an action-packed thrill ride, and they cut to this lady in a Klingon costume, and she says like, well, I just don't know where were the debates or the heavy-handed debates on equality and things like that, and basically saying like, this is an exciting movie and real Star Trek fans hate it. So. Star Trek has always been very cerebral in my mind.
Yeah, and that's definitely like, I'm sure that's where the debates of like Star Trek being not as good as other sci-fi shows or whatever, because like Star Wars, love it or hate it, it popularized that type of sci-fi in a way that is very action heavy and
yes.
reliant on fast, quick things happening. And there is like some amount of philosophy and intellectualism in Star Wars, but not nearly as much as Star Trek, I imagine. Just because when you have a show that's all talking, and I've heard like interesting things in Star Trek episodes, like you were talking about, like the equality and just interesting thought experiments that I wouldn't expect from a show like that.
Right.
It's interesting.
And I think that's what makes Sisko interesting to me, is that he's not as cerebral as Picard is. He's not quite the diplomat that a lot of the other captains and characters are. Sisko is much more ready to fight at the drop of a hat if he needs to. That's not to say that he's like a violent captain, but he's much more comfortable with violence, and he's much more comfortable with being angry than a lot of the other characters are, especially Picard. Like, he and Picard are definitely at odds when it comes to their command style.
Interesting.
For instance, for those of you who may know who the character Q is, played by the great John Delancey, Q makes appearances in all the series from Next Generation to, I believe he made an appearance in one episode of Enterprise in the early 2000s, but I'm not sure. I can't remember if he did or not. Memory's a little fuzzy there, but Picard's interactions with Q are very much debate heavy. He wants to talk to Q. He wants Q's reasoning for why he does what he does. Q interacts with Sisko. 5 minutes in, Sisko punches him in the face. and Q actually says, Picard never punched me in the face. And Sisko responds with, well, I'm not Picard. And so, Sisko is interesting to me because he can be diplomatic. He's very intelligent. He's a very strong character, very strong captain, but he's ready to fight when it's necessary, and there's no hesitation. In fact, he essentially falls in love with one of their new ships called the Defiant, and it's a warship. And Starfleet is kind of opposed to creating warships, but they created one because of this whole Dominion War thing. That's actually where the major story arc for the series comes from.
Okay.
But he's just an interesting captain to me because he's not afraid to fight, but he can still hold his own in a debate. But it's not necessarily always his first go-to.
Yeah. Do you think Captain? Because Sisko was the captain immediately following Picard, or was there a gap in between?
He was the captain, yes, immediately following Picard. He was essentially told he was stationed at Deep Space Nine. They told him, "This is your new command," and he actually resisted it, I believe, in the beginning of the series, but eventually grew to love it. And DS9 did some other interesting things that the other series didn't. DS9 and Sisko, especially Sisko, addressed things like religion, which the other series don't really touch on. and they addressed it with reverence and respect. Which is very different, especially now in a culture that is either extremely hostile towards religion or extremely hostile with their religion.
Right.
It's so, and you have these two extremes. Whereas a show like DS9, while it was fictional religion, showed great respect for it.
Right.
And so it was
especially in a sci-fi show where it's science is the prevalent thing there. It's always interesting when religion is taken into whether like ham-fisted or not, like the Force being sort of religion in Star Wars.
Right.
Sure, there's similar stuff in Star Trek with, you mentioned the fictional religions. But yes, what I wanted to ask was, do you think Sisko being a more, lack of a better term, violent captain than Picard, do you think that was in any way a reaction to people saying that Star Trek was too, I don't know, maybe too safe or too boring? Or
yeah, absolutely. DS9, not only there's this theory, and there's a lot to back up this theory, that Deep Space Nine actually ripped off Babylon 5. So you actually had a lot of the same notes and concepts that were presented to the studio. Turned down Babylon 5, and not like a year later, there's this show called Deep Space Nine, which has similar characters, and sometimes they didn't even change the character names.
Oh no!
The whole concept behind the series of Deep Space Nine was essentially ripped off from Babylon 5, and so with Deep Space Nine, so Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, had passed away not long. A few years before DS9 went on the air.
Okay.
And unfortunately with that, so did a lot of his ideology. Roddenberry believed in a utopian future. DS9 presented this idea that, the future is a utopia, but not really.
Sure.
You get this organization as Section 31. Okay. Organization 13 is Kingdom Hearts.
Yes. I was about to say 13, but I was like, that's Kingdom Hearts.
Yep. Section 31 is basically the Black Ops group for Starfleet.
Okay.
And they introduced this idea that Starfleet is really not this squeaky clean utopian organization that the previous series said it was. And so I'm sure, it was a lot of it was for ratings, because DS9 didn't actually do that well in the beginning in terms of ratings. In fact, most Star Trek doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's any wonder that that any of the series lasted for 7 seasons. But yes, definitely DS9 intentionally created tension between characters. You had characters on the ship or on the space station fighting each other, and Gene Roddenberry would have had none of that. He basically had this philosophy that crewmates are crewmates, they're friends, they're family, they don't fight each other. DS9 kind of threw that out the window and said, sure they do, they absolutely fight each other. And so there was definitely much more emphasis on tension, like interpersonal tension, than there was, which is very modern. A lot of our TV series nowadays
all about that.
They're all about it. They revel in this idea that you can't trust anybody, and no one's really your family, and everybody just fights each other all the time. Whereas Gene Roddenberry, very much rejected that, but DS9 kind of delved into that quite a bit more. So, and I'm sure a lot of it was for ratings.
Oh yeah, for sure. Is there a definitive Star Trek series that sort of went off the deep end of being like they gave in too much to appeal to like a wider audience, that Star Trek fans are like, yeah, we don't talk about that one?
It's the one that's on the air right now.
I figured.
Star Trek Discovery. Within the first 5 minutes, they got everything wrong. And it just tells me that you have people behind the wheel of a Star Trek series that don't actually love Star Trek. You have a network that doesn't love Star Trek. You have a whole group of people who are calling the shots that couldn't care less about Roddenberry's vision. And it's one thing to kind of bend to Roddenberry's vision. It's another thing to just throw it out entirely. And Star Trek Discovery definitely just threw the whole vision of Roddenberry's vision of the future just kind of out the window.
Yeah.
Or out the airlock.
Sure.
So
on brand.
Yeah, definitely. Star Trek Discovery is that show.
That's from what I've gathered and from what I've seen of it. It seems very different. Like you were saying that they're the people trying to place it in a timeline. It's in the Kelvin timeline as opposed to. Oh, I wanted to pitch that you were saying prime timeline. I feel like we should shorten that. Just call it the prime line. But
the prime line.
That's just me personally.
No, I like that.
But it definitely, from just like seeing the trailers, and I think I've seen a little bit of the first episode. I don't remember how.
Discovery.
Yeah, of Discovery.
Okay.
It seems like it's more in line. Like it seems like if Star Trek was like, if there was no Star Trek for years and like for a decade, and the movies came out and they were like, all right, we're gonna start a new Star Trek show. It just seems like it's not based on the things that came before it in terms of the show. It seems like it's based on the J.J. Abrams universe.
Absolutely, and that was a lot of the confusion for the fan base when they stated that, you know, the new Star Trek series will take place in the Prime universe or the Prime line, and we're all very excited for this. But what we got was something that fit into the Kelvin timeline and into the J.J. Abrams universe. If you had told me J.J. Abrams made this Star Trek, I would have believed you. You know, there isn't anything about Star Trek Discovery that tells me or implies that it's a part of the traditional Prime universe.
Right.
And so that upset a lot of viewers. You know, they changed the Klingons entirely.
Really?
They changed they gave the Klingons, and I'm not opposed to change. You know, if you look at the original Klingons from the original series, all the way up to Next Generation and DS9 and so on, there was a huge change to the Klingons. You know, you have to update things. Your budget gets better. Your facial makeup gets better. Prosthetics get better. And so change is good. But they took everything that made the Klingons honorable, everything that made the Klingons identifiable, and again threw it out the window and just made them essentially space monsters. You know, the Klingons are now just the bad guys, and there's no depth. You know, there's no honor. And so they took everything that made the Klingons relatable and just got rid of it.
That sucks.
Yeah, it does. Oh, it does. Absolutely. Yeah, and they told you all of that in like the first few minutes of the first episode.
Really?
Oh yeah, and there was a lot of political inspiration behind that too. You know, they weren't shy. The creators of the show weren't shy about basing the Klingons on like I'm not going to go there, but certain political figureheads and things like that. So it was just very manipulative of the creators to do that. Yeah.
That's definitely, you said that they introduced all that in the first 5 minutes. It definitely seems like everyone working on it was like, hey, if you like Star Trek, you're not going to like this, so stop watching.
Basically,
like, all right,
yes.
Geez, just don't make Star Trek then.
Essentially, yeah. I watched the first, I think, 2 episodes. Wait, no. I only watched the first episode, and I completely lost interest. Because they aired the first episode on CBS, the network, and then they said, essentially, if you want more, pay for CBS All Access, and you'll get the next episode. Yeah. Or episode 2 or 3 or something like that. And I lost respect for CBS after that. Yeah. You know, that you want me to pay to watch a show that you basically teased me with on your network?
Right.
Like, what is that? Yeah.
That's very strange. But
it is, yeah.
Back to Captain Sisko for a bit. I was reading on the Wikipedia page, and I don't know how reliable it is, but does the name Gabriel Bell ring a bell at all?
Gabriel Bell? No, not really. Why?
So it's the Gabriel Bell. There's a little part, and I guess this was an episode of Deep Space Nine where he goes back in time to the 21st century. Captain Sisko does.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay, I do know which episode you're talking about now. Yes.
It's just a short paragraph that I read where he basically goes back in time, and he accidentally causes the death of this guy who apparently was gonna change history, and then he ends up changing history anyway. I'm like, what is this comic book plot that is in Star Trek?
So it was. Yeah, it's very comic booky. It was actually a very intriguing episode. So they end up going back in time. Some of the characters get separated. Sisko ends up accidentally causing the death of this Gabriel Bell character, who was essentially a like mid to late 21st century's Martin Luther King.
Okay, that's sort of the vibe I was getting.
Right, and so Sisko actually ends up fulfilling his role, Gabriel Bell's role, and basically taking on the persona of Gabriel Bell, so that kind of the what's the word I'm looking for, the dominoes fell into place.
Yeah,
and now history remembers, the Star Trek history remembers Sisko's face. So like every record of Gabriel Bell has Sisko's face attached to it.
Sucks to be Gabriel Bell.
Right. So real person in the timeline, whose events were supposed to be, enacted by him.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it very interesting story, because that kind of ties into how mankind fell apart in the 21st century, and then how things got so bad for mankind or humankind, that we basically told ourselves, well, things can't get any worse, and this is where Gabriel Bell and all them kind of come in. Things can't get any worse, so I guess we should really start working together.
Yeah.
And then you get that Roddenberry-esque, utopia from that.
Yeah.
From humanity essentially just falling apart.
Yeah. Interesting. So does stuff like that happen? Like, does time travel stuff and weird plots like that happen a lot in Star Trek, or is that
all the time? All the time.
Okay.
So time travel, especially in Star Trek Voyager, time travel is a main theme in Star Trek Voyager. You essentially have this future section of Starfleet that specializes in time travel, and they play a huge part in Voyager, and they are constantly trying to keep Janeway on the right track. And then you have like Captain Janeway, who basically says, forget the laws of time, or forget the future laws that Starfleet sets in motion. And so Janeway basically flips the bird to all the rules that Starfleet sets in place in the future regarding time travel.
Yeah.
And time travel happens a lot. Every series, I believe, has their go back in time to when the show is on the air episode. So like Voyager goes back to 1997. The TNG goes back to, I don't believe they went back to the 80s. Okay, so maybe I'm lying. But every series has their go back to like the 20th century or something. Episode. And
interesting. I don't know. Again, it's just like misconceptions that someone who's never really watched Star Trek had. I assumed that stuff like that, like more zany stuff like time travel and crazier, like comic book-esque plots wouldn't happen that often. But it's interesting to know that they do.
The show gets weird.
Yeah.
Like, the show gets weird. There is, if you ever have a chance, and anybody who's watching this, go online, go onto YouTube and search for Honest Trailer Star Trek Next Generation. It is one of the funniest things I've ever watched. And it basically points out like a lot of the ridiculous storylines in Star Trek Next Generation. Like one episode where Dr. Crusher basically gets it on with like an alien space ghost entity that lives in her grandmother's old house. It's weird. Star Trek is not immune to strange storylines.
That's good to hear. That definitely attracts me to the show more.
Yeah, definitely.
I like the weirder side of sci-fi for sure.
Yeah, it gets weird. Not like Doctor Who weird,
sure,
but it gets weird. Yeah.
I'd say are you a big Doctor Who person as well?
I'm a huge Whovian. Okay. Oh yeah.
That's another similar thing to Star Trek where I gave Doctor Who more of a chance, and everyone I talked to after saying that I couldn't get into it is like, you did it wrong, and I'm like, sorry?
You did it wrong? How did you do it wrong?
Apparently, I'm supposed to skip ahead like 3 seasons and watch this one specific episode with one specific doctor in it, and that'll sell me on Doctor Who. And I'm like, okay, I started at the beginning. Was that wrong?
Yeah, so the thing about Doctor Who is that the fans are kind of wild.
Yeah.
Doctor Who fans are about as strange as the series itself. And I'd like to think I'm somewhat level-headed. And so if you do want to watch if you have any interest in Doctor Who, start with season 1 of what's called the New Who.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Right, yeah. It's start there. Don't have high expectations.
Yeah.
Like of the series. It is not the greatest series ever made, like some people make it out to be. But what I love about Doctor Who is its strangeness, and that you never really know where the show is going, and there are more episodes where I'm kind of asking myself, like, what is even happening? This is so weird. But that's the exciting thing about the show, is that it is weird, and I like that. If you want weird, watch Doctor Who or Farscape. Farscape was a great, very strange show, pioneered by the Jim Henson Company and things like that. So, yeah. Anyway, back to
Star Trek.
Back to Star Trek.
Sisko.
Yeah.
So, but just like Sisko as like a general character, because you were saying he's more, you're interested in him because he's sort of an anomaly in terms of captains.
Yeah.
Like he's more violent.
That's a good word.
He's more sort of, more quick to action.
Yes.
Are there any, like, the way that he handles relationships with other people on the crew, is that akin to any other captains, or is he like sort of completely his own thing?
I would say, for anybody who's watched most of Star Trek, he's like in terms of his interactions with the crew, he's a good medium between Picard, who very much separated himself from the crew, cared about his crew, but absolutely separated himself, like, emotionally from the people around him, because in his mind a captain needs to be larger than life. And then you have Janeway on the other side, totally on the other side of the spectrum, who in the first few episodes, and we touch on this in the latest Beam Me Up Gary, in the first few episodes, Captain Janeway essentially says, we're in the middle of nowhere, I can't be larger than life for my crew. I need to be accessible, I need to be close to them. They essentially need like a mother on board. And then you have Sisko, who's this kind of happy medium. He hangs out with his crew, he has lunch and dinner with them, he cares about them, he knows what's going on in their personal lives, but he's also not afraid to be distant. And he's not afraid, because he was also the first captain, the first lead character in the Star Trek series who's in a major role of command to have a child. So that was something else that was different about Sisko's. He had a son on board. He was a widower. He had a son who didn't want to join Starfleet, who made friends with one of the Ferengi, and the Ferengi are like one of the most hated races in the Star Trek universe. Not because they're evil, but because they're just annoying.
Sure.
And so his son becomes best friends with a character that he can't stand, and so you have a family dynamic for your main captain that you just don't have in any other series. And so this leads to a lot of really interesting decisions that the captain makes, because it's not just a crew of a starship. This is a space station that has civilians and people just passing through, and it has Starfleet officers, but it also has officers from another, essentially, space military. I'm trying to use terms that non-Star Trek fans would understand.
Sure.
And so you have this character who has more at stake than just his own life and the life of his crew. There's anyway, and I do have to state one of the other big differences about DS9 from the other series is that the ship that they're on was not built by Starfleet. It's actually, it was built by the Cardassians, and so it's actually kind of an image of military domination that they're occupying, that Starfleet takes over.
Interesting.
And so, they're very politically driven series, much more so than most of the others. The other series are much more about exploration, and DS9 is much more about politics and religion and how they kind of interact with each other. So,
do you think that is Sisko's character sort of intrinsically like tied to the political and the religious aspects of Deep Space Nine? Or is he just sort of there along for the ride?
No, he actually becomes what what one of the races call their emissary. So in the first episode is actually called Emissary, and it establishes the fact that DS9 is planted next to a wormhole, and within this wormhole, these kind of ethereal beings exist and live. But the race of beings who live on the planet next to the wormhole have regarded these beings as gods.
Okay.
And so Sisko has actually been chosen as the emissary to what are called the prophets.
Interesting.
And these like godlike characters. So Sisko immediately becomes intertwined with the politics and the religion of Bajor, which is the planet, and the Bajorans. So the Bajorans actually view him as like a religious symbol, as a religious leader. He's not religious in any way. In fact, he never asked for any of this. He didn't ask to be on DS9. He didn't ask to become the emissary. He didn't ask, to lose his wife in one of the Borg conflicts. And so again, you have this very interesting character who's not only a captain, but he's a religious leader. But he doesn't want to be a religious leader.
Yeah.
And it just becomes this very interesting. In fact, there's one episode where the prophets visit him and tell him not to get married, but he gets married anyway, and then everything kind of, falls apart. And anyway, he's again not my favorite captain, but there were episodes where far too many episodes where he wasn't prominent enough in the show that I actually lost interest in the episode, because the figurehead of the series, probably the most interesting character on the series, doesn't make an appearance for 2 or 3 episodes at a time. But I don't know if that's because Avery Brooks was still teaching at the time. I know he was I think he was a theater or jazz professor at a college somewhere. So anyway, he definitely becomes intertwined with the politics and religion of the series.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense for seems like for his character being like a different, not a non-traditional captain.
Extremely, extremely non-traditional.
Which that would definitely attract like more interest in a character like that. Just someone. Someone different or something different is usually it's either met with like a lot of hate or like, ooh, that's cool, I like that, instead of everything else. So
yeah, absolutely. And you really did have, so in the original series you had Kirk, Captain Kirk. He's the kind of playboy character. He's very very John Wayne space cowboy-ish. He has swagger, but he was a little flawless, and that he always succeeded.
Yeah.
You have Picard, who's this very dignified, very British Frenchman. That's kind of a running joke, is that, for being a Frenchman, you are certainly very British. But again, also almost a little too perfect. And so you have some character development with him, with romantic relationships and how becoming a Borg, affected him. And then you have Captain Sisko, who's the opposite. His temper gets the better of him sometimes.
Yeah.
He isn't so sure about what his role is. He's not so sure about where he is and what he's doing and whether or not he's even right half the time.
Yeah.
And so you have this character who definitely has a lot more kind of inner turmoil than other characters, than other captains do, and not all of his decisions work out for the better, in the end. And so he's probably the most relatable captain that I've ever watched, and at times even the most interesting captain to watch.
Yeah.
Because he's very flawed, and I think that's what makes him so appealing.
Yeah. Those are definitely the types of characters that I latch onto, is characters with very apparent flaws that don't always work out for them. Like, they learn from them, but stuff that like maybe his violence or something is eventually gonna come and bite him in the ass in some way.
Oh, and it does. Yeah, absolutely.
I would imagine that's definitely like the Chekhov's gun of his personality. Like, something's gonna happen here eventually.
Yep, definitely. Good reference, by the way. I like that.
Thanks. But yeah, it seems like he's as the main dude of Deep Space Nine. I feel like from what you've described, they did a really good job of making him like indicative of the changes that Deep Space Nine was bringing to Star Trek. Of, you were mentioning earlier all the new and different things that Deep Space Nine did. Seems like Sisko mirrored that in his new and different captain style.
He did. Yeah, that's a good observation. He did embody the changes that were being made to Star Trek, but they were respectful changes, I believe. They didn't just throw everything out the airlock. The changes were really... DS9 was answering questions that people were asking. And that is that, those questions of, is this really a utopia, or does it just seem like one? Is everything really as perfect as it appears? And how is Starfleet actually affecting other planets and other races? Is Starfleet really that perfect? And so you had DS9, this show that showed that crewmates and family members fight. It's expected, right? And so it was a much grittier, more honest take on Star Trek, but it didn't disrespect Star Trek. It kept true to the nature of Star Trek, and I would even say to Roddenberry's vision, it just showed some of the dirt on Roddenberry's vision. It got under the surface a little bit, but it still respected it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last question before we wrap up. Do you think Deep Space Nine, as sort of in a vacuum, I know that I now know that there are some continuity sharing things between series. But would Deep Space Nine be like a good jumping on point for people who might now be, because I'm honestly a little more interested in Star Trek than I was an hour ago.
Great.
Would it be like a good place to just start watching Star Trek?
Yes, I actually think DS9 or Voyager for a modern audience would be the best place to start. DS9, because it is much more or much less episodic. It's not episodic, but it's much less episodic than older 80s and 90s television series were. The acting, I'd say the talent in the acting is better. So in season, what is it? I'm trying to remember here. 4, I think it's 3 or 4. They introduced this thing called the Dominion Wars, and the Dominion Wars stretch from season 3 or 4 to the end of the series, and it's actually this ongoing story that just keeps you engaged, the entire time. So DS9, is a great place to start because especially for a first season. It has a great first season if you were to compare that to the first season of Next Generation, which was garbage. The second season of Next Generation was also garbage.
Oh no!
That's a series where you really do have to jump in at like season 3 to appreciate it. DS9 starts off strong, from the first episode. And works out. Every show kind of has to work out its kinks. When they get the new uniforms, and if you've watched the series, you know what I'm talking about. When they get the new uniforms, that's when the show really kind of finds itself.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I think I'm surprised at us. We talked for a good chunk of time about Star Trek.
Yeah, we did.
Even though one of us doesn't know anything about Star Trek. I say that every time. There's always like an anxiety that I have of like when some. I've only done 4 episodes of these now, but whenever someone's like, "Hey, we're gonna talk about Captain Sisko for an hour," I'm like, who?
Who?
What? Like normally I make notes, and I was just I'll have notes and questions that I've drummed up, but this time I was like, I don't know. I just have his Wikipedia page pulled up because I read through it and I was like, I'm just gonna wing it. And it turned out okay, I think.
You did great. Obviously, I experienced the same thing with, Rob and Benny when they talk about comics.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know anything about this, but I can ask questions, I can learn.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. So where can, you mentioned earlier at the top, but for people who maybe skipped ahead, where can people find you, Gary?
You can actually find me on YouTube at Film Circuit. On that channel, I focus mostly on essentially just filmmaking, but I do delve into sci-fi and fantasy a lot on that channel. You can also find me on Twitter at GaryCam4, and just hit me up with a message if you like this discussion, and let me know what you think. And also hit me up for more ideas for episodes of Beam Me Up Gary. I love taking suggestions for that show.
Yeah. And you can find me on this YouTube channel if you're watching it on Auram's Comics. If not, I'm on Twitter at Auram Alexander, or wherever else you're seeing this. Sometimes, if you're watching this on like someone else's channel who just re-uploaded it, don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that.
Go away. Go to my channel instead.
Does that happen?
Oh yeah, it sucks. There's like
Weird.
this legion of like 3 channels. I'm pretty sure they're just bots that just immediately re-upload my videos and
Weird.
just like copy and paste all the metadata, and I need to go in and claim it, but like YouTube's verbiage for when you make a copyright claim is so scary that every time I want to do it, I'm like, I don't want to give you my address. Why do you need it? Like, I just
Wow.
take this video down. It's mine.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, it's not great. I don't know if they've done it in a while, but there was a time like months ago where every single video, which is like even to the point, if you search Auram's Comics on just Google, not YouTube, luckily, but if you search Auram's Comics on
Right.
Google, first videos that come up are my videos, but not from my channel, and that sucks. But
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I'll deal with that eventually.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for coming, Gary. This is-
Yeah. Thank you for having me on your show. It's great.
Yay, I'm glad to hear that. So cool. That's it. I don't have a sign off. I feel like I should find a sign off. Do you have some form of a sign off, Gary?
I do. So thank you for
Do it.
watching this episode of Insert Character.
Yeah.
Again, you can find us on Twitter and YouTube where you found us. And yeah, just follow the links below, and like, comment, subscribe, and share if you liked what you saw.
Thanks for doing my job for me.
Yeah, not a problem.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.